Next, on Weapons at War. They travel at lightning speeds, delivering their precious cargo, the infantry, directly into the heart of battle. From the primitive armored cars in World War I to armored assault teams in World War II, slashing through the jungles of Vietnam and racing over the sands of the Middle East. Evolutionary wonders who rocket into the 20th century as if man and machine were one, unmatched in mobility, protection, and firepower. They are the Mechanized Forces. Next on Weapons at War.
Mobility has always been a key to victory on the battlefield. The Roman Empire could not have dominated the ancient world as it did without its vast network of roads. From horse-drawn chariots to this century's earliest armored cars, military leaders have sought a more effective way of getting their troops to critical points on the battlefield in the shortest possible time. Theorists realized that separately, the infantry, artillery, and the cavalry had their limitations, but brought together as a combined mechanized force, they form an army's most powerful combat team. When the ground campaign of Desert Storm began, the U.S. Army had deployed to the Saudi Arabian desert 1,200 main battle tanks, 2,200 armored personnel carriers, and a combined coalition force of 580,000 troops. Although outnumbered, the Allied forces were soon to prove that they were perhaps the finest mechanized force ever committed to the battlefield.
We knew the vehicles could do it. We knew we were up for it. And we were so confident in the plan when we learned it that really we were just raring to go.
We got the call about 10:00 the 24th of February, cross now. And we crossed in. And a tremendous feeling of this huge mechanized force, tremendous firepower and lethality. And you looked around you and there were hundreds upon hundreds of tracked vehicles all moving north. It was absolutely incredible the amount of power that was there. And when we hit the valley, the Iraqis were totally surprised.
Didn't meet too much resistance at first. We fired a few shots and blew up a couple of things, and after that they started coming out with their hands up.
So far, we haven't had any main gun engagements against any enemy armor. Basically, as we pull up to the positions, they see the armor, the heavy tanks is rolling up, they just surrender so far.
The Iraqis were completely overwhelmed by the speed and coordination of the mechanized attack and realized the futility of challenging the huge armored force.
When they swept around the outer flanks of the Iraqi army, they just decimated them because they were highly mobile. And they moved so fast, the Iraqis didn't even know where they were.
One of the vehicles that provided the key to this rapid movement was the Bradley fighting vehicle.
The primary role of the Bradley was to enable the infantry to keep up with the tanks, and when they came across obstacles, for example, enemy trenches, they would dismount, clear those trenches, and then push on. The Bradley, with its 25mm cannon, can engage other light armoured vehicles, for example, BMPs. If a Bradley came across a Russian tank, it could quite easily knock it out from the sides or rear using its 25mm cannon. The terrain has an important part in mechanised warfare. If you look at the Middle East, you have vast expanses of desert, so you can use mechanised forces to their full degree.
And when we talked to the prisoners later on, they were absolutely stunned. And they said, how did you get here? And we said, through that desert. And they said, nobody can ever go through that desert. It's impossible. No roads, no anything, but 250 miles in, and it worked.
Traditionally, the higher your rate of advance, the lower your casualties are. In fact, if you look at Operation Desert Storm, it was very much a blitzkrieg war, a fast-moving war, and casualties on the Allied side tended to be very low.
They wouldn't have been able to sustain this unrelenting pace without the help of their maintenance units.
Then you go to a mechanized infantry battalion and you've got 100 mechanics. You know, 1/8 of the battalion is guys that fix things.
I would say for the man hours, total time considered, everything we did over there, a good 40% of it went into maintenance.
The first glimpse of mechanized warfare came with the arrival of the horse-drawn war chariot. Its mobility shattered the phalanx of the foot soldier on the ancient battlefield. The chariot gave way to the soldier on horseback, who could fight with even greater speed and mobility. One of the first modern conflicts to demonstrate the importance of the large-scale use of cavalry was the American Civil War.
In the Civil War, there were the movements of people like Stonewall Jackson and Phil Sheridan and the cavalry and infantry officers who moved very rapidly. And they realized that this rapid movement with cavalry was very effective and became extremely effective by both sides.
It wasn't until the advent of the automobile that effective weapon power and mobility could be raised to a new level. This revolutionary concept in transportation foreshadowed an entirely new means of military transportation. In 1899, at an exhibition of motor vehicles, a British engineer, Frederick R. Sims, demonstrated a self-propelled quadricycle, which he had fitted with a Maxim machine gun. These early inventions were the first steps towards the motorized combat vehicle. In the early part of World War I, the armies were primarily mobilized by horses. The Germans thought they would be able to break through the lines and destroy the French quickly, but they found horses to be insufficient. What was needed to achieve their goal was motorized transportation. In an attempt to mobilize, troop trains were used to carry supplies, ammunition, soldiers, and even their horses. Despite the use of the railroads to carry troops over great distances, infantry on both sides were still far from the front lines. Soldiers were expected to cover miles and miles of ground before going to battle. By the time they arrived at their destination, extreme fatigue had set in. Too often, this was more than the average foot soldier could endure. One of the earliest examples of the mechanized movement of troops actually employed civilian vehicles.
Battle of Marne in World War I, the Germans got to Meaux, which is about 60 miles northeast of Paris. And this was pretty close. And the French were desperate, and they did have troops in Paris, and they commandeered all the taxi cabs in Paris. I think they got over 1,000 taxi cabs. Loaded the French in there, and they were able to bring out enough troops to block the gap and set up a defense at the Battle of the Marne. And the French won that battle because they were able to bring the reserves up fast enough to do it. And a lot of the people give the taxi cabs the credit for doing that, because if they hadn't, they wouldn't have been able to get the troops out there quickly.
Primitive armored cars represented the earliest form of protected fighting vehicles.
Before trench warfare set in, armoured cars proved very useful because they did have a certain amount of mobility on roads. They could travel along roads very quickly. In those days, the cavalry had horses, but they were still rather slow. The reason that they could not be used was once trench warfare set in, the ground became very much covered with shrapnel, shell fire, deep potholes, and in those sort of terrain, an armoured car, particularly with only two of the forwards, cannot operate, it cannot move. And for that reason, the tank came on, which could cross deep ditches. It had better cross-country mobility. The very first British tank was called Little Willie. It was a full-track vehicle with just a very large superstructure, but it did prove the basic concept.
Once this terrible French warfare settled down to a stalemate, and after they go over the top, they'd be slaughtered by machine guns. The machine guns would just tear them up, and the artillery would catch them out in the open, and it was brutal. And so somebody got the idea that if they could build an armored vehicle, it could go across this no man's land and knock out these machine gun nests and eventually break through back to where they get to the artillery, that they could save a lot of lives.
The British then developed the Mark I tank. Earlier tank designs had a high center of gravity, and the length of the tracks were too short to cross wide trenches. Therefore, this new series was designed with an elongated chassis to keep the center of gravity low and give the tracks more contact with the ground. They were armed with two 6-pound naval guns, fitted at the sides, and could move at a top speed of 4 miles per hour. Each tank was manned by a crew of 8.
British tanks proved highly effective during the First World War. They were able to punch a hole through the German lines. And the idea was for the cavalry and infantry to follow. But unfortunately, the cavalry on horses, the infantry on foot. So the real value of the tank could not be fully exploited.
The French too recognized the need for mechanized vehicles. Based on the American Holt tractor, they developed the Schneider medium tank. This tracked armored vehicle could carry a crew of 6 and was armed with a 75mm main gun and 2 Hotchkiss machine guns. Top speed was only 3.7 miles per hour. The French also built a very successful light tank, the Renault FT-17. It had a crew of 2 and was the first tank to incorporate a turning gun turret. Several thousand Renaults were built during World War I. The Germans' attempt at tank development was the A7V, which was basically a large armored box on a whole tractor-type chassis. It weighed about 30 tons and carried a crew of 18.
The Germans just were not that effective in tank development in World War I, but they saw the advantage of it, but they just didn't get into it like the French and British did.
When the United States came into the war, they had no vehicles of their own in production. So their first tanks used were some British and some French tanks. It was then decided that a new tank would be manufactured in the United States and in France for use by the Allied forces, and this became the Mark VIII. This was generally much bigger than the British tank and was armed with machine guns. It had very good cross-country mobility because it had very wide tracks and was much longer. Therefore, it could cross much wider tank traps than the British.
The tank became a landmark in the history of ground warfare, and from it dates the large-scale development of armored vehicles and mechanized forces.
Weapons at War will return in a moment.
After World War I, we got into this long period during the Depression years where tank development in this country practically came to a halt because we had no money.
During the Depression, the total budget for tank development was only $85,000 a year. Despite the lack of funds, a few new tanks were designed. While America faced financial difficulties in mechanizing her force, Germany was banned entirely from military development.
In the 1930s, the Germans started a major rearmament campaign. Under the Treaty of Versailles, the Germans were banned from making certain types of weapons, but they managed to do it. They did it undercover or in association with other countries, particularly the former Soviet Union. They had a number of joint development programs. So by the time war was declared, they did have a fairly good range of armored vehicles.
Early German tank designs proved to have significant weaknesses, so they started a crash development program that would eventually produce a series of powerful tanks. Although the Germans were still on their way to being completely mechanized, their warfare tactics allowed them to get the most out of what they had. They created the most swift and powerful style of warfare yet known to man, the Blitzkrieg.
Blitzkrieg is brute force using tanks, artillery, infantry and air power as a cohesive unit to push through enemy lines and exploit that advance.
The devastating success of the Blitzkrieg clearly illustrated the kind of mobile force each side would have to employ on the battlefields of World War II. At the heart of the Blitzkrieg advance was the German Panzer Division. These divisions represented a new style fighting force of both greater mobility and greater striking power.
The German tanks had a fairly good engine in them. They had much heavier armor and a much more powerful gun and a wider track. The German tanks could go into rough terrain and soft ground where our tanks would get stuck. And so whenever we had to go face to face with a German tank, they could always outgun us. And that was proved to be an extremely costly thing. Our tank losses were terrible because of this.
To complement their aggressive tank divisions, the Germans developed half-track personnel carriers. These troop movers were basically trucks that had had their rear axles replaced by a track system.
The Germans had a half-track much larger than ours. It had a great big long Christie suspension type track which ran around 3/4 length of the vehicle. They probably carried 30 or 40 men in that half-track. It was a big thing, but it didn't have any armor on it, it didn't have any guns on it. It was used strictly for transporting troops across rugged terrain.
Initially, the Germans were the only ones that had the tanks and the infantry work closely together. As everyone learned the lessons from the German experience, it became sort of standard operating procedure that you had to keep armored infantry and armored personnel carriers. In this case, we kept armored infantry up with the tanks in half-track vehicles.
The American half-track initially entered service in 1941. The driver was protected by armor on the front and sides, but the top of the troop compartment was unarmored. Once dismounted, the troops could defend their tanks from enemy infantry attacking with anti-tank weapons or magnetic mines.
When tanks were moving forward, obviously the infantry, if they were going at high speed, wanted to move with them. So the armored personnel carrier enabled the infantry to travel fairly close behind the tanks, and once the tanks had taken ground, the infantry could hold it. Also, they could be used dismount and house-to-house fighting. So the half-track was really halfway between a tank and an armored car.
The half-track became an important part of the mobile assault team. And the Allies quickly recognized the importance of combining several types of vehicles to form a more complete mechanized force.
The basic vehicles we would have in a fighting unit would be the half-track, 2.5-ton trucks, and the Jeep. The 2.5-ton truck was our basic means of transporting everything else the normal unit had. I think the 2.5-ton truck was a very good vehicle, served us well. The normal soldier could do first echelon maintenance on a 2.5-ton truck engine. It wasn't complicated, didn't have all this these gadgets that you find on vehicles today where you have to be a college graduate to work on. The half-tracks were the same way, and the Jeep was also.
Aided by this simplicity, Allied maintenance crews, often operating close to the front lines, proved they were capable of keeping the vehicles operational.
We learned there that you have to keep your maintenance up forward. It has to be heavily reinforced in order to do that. But with maintenance, we worked 24 hours a day that never stopped.
One of the simplest, most dependable, and versatile of the American vehicles was the Jeep.
The Jeep was developed to meet the US requirements for a light cross-country vehicle which could be used for a wide range of roles and produced in significant quantities quickly.
America began designing a new general-purpose vehicle. The Army required a sturdy automobile with a low center of gravity capable of carrying 2 to 4 men. It had to be light without sacrificing strength, stability, or durability. With these guidelines in mind, American automakers began designing the new vehicle, which was officially designated the GP. but became better known as the Jeep. Once prototypes of this new vehicle had been built, researchers put it through a torturous series of tests. In order to survive the rigors of battle, it had to be capable of withstanding the harshest weather and terrain. In 1940, the finished product was introduced. It weighed less than 2,200 pounds and had a 60 horsepower engine, enabling it to attain a top speed of 70 miles per hour. At first, the Army was skeptical of the Jeep's awkward appearance, but its versatility and durability soon won them over.
It was a marvelous vehicle. It would go up hills, it would go down hills, it would go through rough ground, it would even go in snow and ice.
The Jeep was a very maneuverable little automobile. You could go any place the tanks would go. You could get into terrain, in and out of open country, closed country. It had four-wheel drive. Mechanically, a very good piece of equipment.
At the height of production, one Jeep was turned out every 2 minutes, most of which were crated up and shipped overseas.
It was never actually used as an APC because it could only carry 4 people, and it was really used as a radio vehicle, as a light reconnaissance vehicle, and it was often fitted with some machine guns. The Air Force used it, the reconnaissance people used it, the British SAS used it in France. So it was really a multi-role army vehicle which could be used for a wide range of missions.
The Jeep was mighty good as a command vehicle, not that it offered any protection, but it was good to command from. Very hard to command from a heavy tank. You don't have your visibility, there's so much noise, other confusion. I found that most commanders got into the Jeep to do their commanding from.
Besides simply moving troops and equipment, the Jeep could provide local firepower as well as quickly evacuating wounded personnel, providing the Allies with a superior general-purpose vehicle that the Germans could never match.
The Germans had a little VW, and the German also rode on the VW, but they don't have a two-wheel drive in the rear. They couldn't go places our people could go. It was far superior than the Germans had.
In 1933, Adolf Hitler asked Dr. Porsche to invent or design a lightweight vehicle. Initially, there was some concern that because the vehicle was not four-wheel drive, that it would not be very effective for use in the military. But because of the fact that this vehicle weighs only about 1,000 pounds, 2 or 3 soldiers could simply get it out of most of the problems that it could get itself into. It had a very small engine, about 30 horsepower, and yet could travel on a paved highway 60, 70 miles an hour without any problem.
Unlike the Germans, the American vehicles could be produced in large numbers using a non-specialized workforce. Many of the German vehicles were built like Swiss watches. They were too complicated and couldn't be built quickly. The Americans concentrated on a number of small designs and produced them in quantity. They built over 40,000 half-tracks. American industry could produce things quickly and efficiently, something the German industry could never compete with.
Weapons at War will return in a moment.
With the introduction of the Sherman tank, the United States demonstrated its ability to produce in great quantity, but perhaps with a sacrifice in quality.
American tanks, mechanically, were, relatively speaking, pretty good. We had a power traverse. Our small arms were good. Our main gun was good. It just was too low a velocity. It wasn't equal to the German gun. The armor in our tanks was good. It just wasn't heavy enough. The Germans had much heavier armor and much higher velocity guns. Whenever we got a tank knocked out, sometimes it's pretty bad inside. The tank crew gets hit. Sometimes the bodies just disintegrate. It's terrible. And so our crews would have to get inside, and the Graves registration would take the body parts out and put them in sacks, and we would move them all to one side, try to identify them. And then you'd have to get inside the tank and clean it out with formaldehyde. And then we used some other strong disinfectants. And then we had to replace all the wiring because a lot of times the tank would catch on fire. Because we didn't want that crew to know that tank had been knocked out, because the crews were very reticent about getting in a tank that had been knocked out before noticing men had been killed in it. And they didn't want to take those tanks. So we tried to paint them and disinfect them and do everything. And still, when you got inside that tank, you could smell that very faint stench of the deceased bodies in there. It was extremely uncomfortable. And we'd tell the men, well, that's just the paint we put in there. But they did take them, but they didn't want to. They were leery about it, and I don't blame them.
Casualties were also high in the Pacific Theater, where a different type of mechanized troop carrier was used. The LVT series of amphibious vehicles allowed troops to storm strongly defended beaches in the island-hopping campaign.
They had an armoured version which is called the LVTP, Landing Vehicle Track Personnel. The first ones were unarmoured, then they were armoured, and these were widely used by the US Marines for their island hopping campaigns in the Far East. They could be launched from ships offshore and get inland. The first ones were unarmoured, then they were fitted with armour plate, machine gun turret, even some had 75mm howitzers. The Marines called them Amtrak. They enabled them to go from ships offshore across a shell and machine gun infested beach inland.
In Europe, the tide of the war was beginning to change. After the Allies landed at Normandy, they managed to break out from the beaches and gain momentum as they moved farther inland. The Allies had learned the lessons of mobility from the German Blitzkrieg and were now using similar tactics to their advantage.
Mobility was an extremely effective thing once a breakthrough is made. Once you make a breakout is where you keep going. And that's what we did when we got out of Normandy. We went 700 miles from Normandy up to the Siegfried Line before we stopped.
A major contribution to this swift advance was the work of the Engineering Corps. The combat engineers kept the lanes of attack open by repairing roads, sweeping for landmines, and building bridges in order to keep the strong mechanized force of the Allies moving. The glory of Blitzkrieg had faded, and the Germans' lack of production was becoming more and more evident.
A lot of their artillery in 1940 was still drawn by horses. So although the German army is often thought about a mechanized force, much of it was still relatively out of date with horse-drawn artillery. And of course, they could not keep up with the tanks.
Soon the Allies reached the very heart of Germany.
The American forces actually were kept out of Berlin until the Russians had fairly well taken the city and were mopping up. The 2nd Armored Division that I was with had the distinct honor of being the first ally of the American forces to enter the city of Berlin in our American sector. And my impressions of Berlin were, I just stood there on the corner one morning and said, by golly, we made it. I'm finally here, and the war is now over. It was a strange feeling. And it was also a strange feeling to me to be able to have a couple of trips to the Reichstag, which was burned out at the time, and to go to the Chancellery where Hitler held forth, and to see what was left of the great German might. When you look back at all the way from Normandy all the way into Berlin, it seems so far distant. When you think back and all the people that you lost and all your friends that were not there to celebrate it with you, if you call it a celebration. I didn't call it a celebration. I think it was just a contentment that we had done our part.
Weapons at War will return in a moment.
By the close of World War II, The large-scale use of mechanization had revolutionized the foot soldier's ability to respond quickly to the dynamics of combat. In a few years, however, the vehicles and the crews were forced to meet new challenges. Instead of fighting across the open landscape of Europe, units were now being called to smaller conflicts in more remote parts of the world, where rough terrain made the rapid movement of troops far more difficult. In the Korean War, little had changed in the mechanized forces. The Army realized that its vehicles of World War II vintage would not be adequate for future conflicts. An important step towards updating the mechanized force was the introduction of the M113 armored personnel carrier. The infantrymen finally had a fast and fully armored practical means of protective transportation. Fully loaded, the M113 weighed 25,000 pounds and traveled at a speed of 40 miles per hour over rough terrain. Like the Jeep of World War II, it was relatively cheap, simple to manufacture, and easy to maintain. Designers positioned the vehicle's engine where it could be easily removed for repairs. The M113 had a boxy hull built from welded aluminum. It carried a crew of 2 and 11 infantry troops. The driver was seated at the front of the hull to the left. The commander's hatch was in the center of the roof, and the troop compartment was in the back. The infantry dismounted through a rear ramp. Although this design was very practical, it did not allow for many creature comforts.
You knew you were inside a washboard. In fact, in there, you got bounced around pretty good inside. You're basically in darkness. Obviously, you can see the driver, and you've got some visibility there, but at the same time, you were in a very closed environment in there.
Although the mountainous regions of Vietnam would allow only limited use of mechanized units, the M113 proved it could beat a path through the jungle.
The M113 was used very aggressively. It would be pushed into suspected Viet Cong areas, backed up by tanks. The infantry would either fight from their vehicles or dismount and fight on foot. The biggest worry for M113 crews was obviously attack by RPG-7s or mines. Mines was a killer in Vietnam, and for that reason, very often they put sandbags inside the vehicles for added protection. All the crews and the infantry would prefer to sit on the top of the vehicle rather than be inside, because if you went over a mine, it could be catastrophic, particularly as many of the early 113s were powered by petrol engines.
The problem was that here you were drawing fire, particularly rocket-propelled grenades. That combination of the explosion of the grenade with the shaped charge and gasoline that you had in your fuel tanks was devastating.
The first one had a petrol engine. The next one was the M113A1, which had a diesel engine, which was more fuel efficient, it was safer, and gave a longer range of action.
Additions such as safer fuel, increased armor, and more effective guns had improved the M113. However, they had also made this personnel carrier a high priority target.
Because of the capability, you instantly become a target for anything that the enemy has that they think is sufficiently good to get you, as opposed to getting to the infantryman that may be walking to your side. And of course, conversely, infantrymen like to have you along, but then again, they really don't want to have people drawing fire, so that you want to have tanks and ACAVs, but you want to have them far enough away that you're not going to be hit when they're trying to hit them.
The Army still recognized the importance of the infantry, personnel carriers, and tanks working together as a combined team.
The vehicle was never actually used only on its own. It had to be used with other weapon systems to ensure the battlefield success.
The vehicle was never intended to be an offensive weapon or literally be right in the heat of the battle. That was not its design or its purpose. Its purpose literally was to transport you to the point of battle. You would ride the vehicle to the next terrain feature behind your objective. But until you secured the objective, then you could bring the vehicle forward to assist in consolidation of the objective. But you did not expose the vehicle itself. You tried not to expose that to enemy fire if at all possible.
The basic M113 is armed with a 50 cal machine gun. But it became apparent in Vietnam that the vehicle needed additional firepower. So the gunner was provided with additional armor protection, and additional 7.62 machine guns were mounted over the top of the rear troop compartment. These gave a much more suppressive fire, particularly when running into ambushes.
Despite its armor protection and potent firepower, the M113 was by no means indestructible. American troops were often caught off guard by the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong. Ambushes took a great toll on American vehicles as well as men. Those who did not die in battle had to endure the wretched conditions of a POW camp. Though clearly superior in firepower and mobility, the Americans met formidable opponents in the light and highly motivated North Vietnamese forces. In December 1989, the U.S. Mechanized Force was once again called to action to help remove General Manuel Noriega from power in Panama. The Marine Corps LAVs were dispatched to the area.
While the United States Army have never really liked wheeled armored vehicles in the post-war period, one part of the U.S. Armed Forces has. That is the United States Marine Corps. They have a whole family of wheeled armored vehicles called the LAV, the Light Armored Vehicle. The basic vehicle is called the LAV-25, with a two-man turret with a 25mm cannon and a 7.62 machine gun. It is a full 8x8 drive, so it's got good cross-country mobility, and it is amphibious. These are used by the Marine Corps for scouting missions, flanks, covering, and so on.
The wheeled LAVs proved versatile enough to travel on roads when tracked vehicles would do too much damage to the pavement. In Panama, the LAVs proved to be yet another powerful weapon in the arsenal of the mechanized forces.
Weapons at War will return in a moment.
In the 1980s, the mechanized force was re-equipped and modernized with powerful new machines, including the M1 Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, and the Humvee. Each of these vehicles has its own strategic importance, but the Abrams main battle tank remains the heart of any mechanized unit because of its superior firepower. The M1, which carries a crew of 4, is armed with a 120mm smoothbore main gun. It's protected by sophisticated composite armor, which significantly increases the tank's survivability. The M1 is highly mobile and can reach speeds of over 45 miles per hour.
What most people don't realize is that the number one characteristic of the Abrams was the survivability of the American soldier.
In Desert Storm, only 4 Abrams tanks were lost to enemy fire, and the crews survived.
In the Gulf War, there was a big question as to whether our M1 tank would be adequate to handle the T-72. It certainly had the firepower and it had the optical sighting, so that in tank versus tank battles, the M1 won clearly and set the standards for the tanks of the world.
The destructive power of the Abrams allows it to quickly move forward into enemy territory, but it still needs the support of the infantry.
I mean, I'm sure glad that we trained as hard as we did, because we actually, 113s, when we're attached to tankers, we guard their rear. And as they go rolling through and doing what they're supposed to do, we're supposed to ensure that nothing hits them from behind, because that's where they're most vulnerable.
The M113 is still a very dependable vehicle. Just because it can't move as fast as an M1A1 tank doesn't mean it's not that effective. Its dependability, maintenance, and its versatility makes it a very effective vehicle, particularly on a modern battlefield and with mechanized forces.
It's a workhorse. It is an absolute workhorse. That thing will go forever. You can put it back together again with baling wire, bubble gum, and whatever. The problem with it is that it is also not lethal, not fast, and it doesn't offer a lot of protection. It's above the old half-track in protection, but I've seen small arm rounds go through a 113.
Although it has its limitations, it is still one of the most versatile vehicles in the Army.
The military does everything that it possibly can to get the maximum bang for the buck. And the 113 is just a tremendous example of that, where we've taken a very basic vehicular system and evolved it into an enormous number of uses within the military services that still serves us very, very well today and will for the foreseeable time frame.
But the Army needed a vehicle that would enable the American infantry to keep pace with the main battle tanks, both to protect and support them. The Bradley fighting vehicle was developed. It is fast, protected against small arms fire, and like the tank, carries a powerful main gun of its own.
Two versions of the Bradley were built, the M2, the infantry fighting vehicle, and the M3, the cavalry fighting vehicle. They both have the two-man turret with a 25mm cannon, a 7.62mm machine gun, and a twin tow missile launcher. That cannon can be aimed and fired whilst the vehicle is moving across country with a high degree of first-round hit. If it sees enemy tanks, it can either withdraw or engage them with its tow launcher. The tow missile has a range of 3,750 meters and, depending on the model, should knock out most types of tank to be encountered on the battlefield.
The Bradley's thermo-imaging technology enables it to engage enemy targets both day and night. Like the Abrams, one of the most important features in the Bradley is its high survivability. The crew compartments have been fitted with spall liners, which protect against flying fragments generated when the vehicle's armor is penetrated.
It's more than just a carrier. A tremendous amount of firepower and capability and the increased lethality so that the infantryman doesn't have to get out 1,000 meters from the objective and make his way across open ground under fire to get there, because the 113 can't survive. The Bradley, with greater survivability, can get him almost to the objective before they have to get out.
Some years ago, the Bradley did come under a lot of hostile criticism because it did not have the same degree of protection as the M1 tank. If you want an infantry vehicle to have the same degree of protection, you will end up with a vehicle of the size and weight and indeed the cost of an M1 tank. So when you develop a vehicle, it's always a trade-off. Mix and match. The Bradley has probably got the best survivability of any of its type of vehicle in the world today.
The combination with which you achieve your will on the ground is the tank infantry team. Today it's the Abrams and the Bradley working together, each designed to complement and support the other.
The Army also upgraded its general purpose vehicle. They replaced the Jeep with the high mobility, multi-purpose wheeled vehicle, popularly known as the Humvee. The Humvee is a 2.5-ton vehicle produced in 18 different variations. Like the Jeep, the Humvee is reliable, sturdy, capable of operating in all types of terrain, and readily adaptable to a variety of missions. Improvements over the Jeep include a better power-to-weight ratio, twice the payload, automatic transmission, power steering, and better ground clearance. The deployment to the Gulf highlighted the need for strategic mobility. The war demonstrated that mechanized forces were essential for victory. However, amid all of these high-tech wonders, one must not forget that without the highly skilled soldier, a vehicle's potential cannot be fulfilled.
There's a lot of people who think that being an infantryman is easy, or that's a young guy that's not too bright and that's the reason he's in the infantry. And I'll tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that he has to be and is the smartest young man we've got in the Army today, particularly in the mechanized infantry. He's got to know how to drive that vehicle, how to shoot that vehicle, how to maintain that vehicle. He's the one that makes it all happen. We don't win wars if he's not on the ground closing with the enemy. Bottom line.
These warriors still recognize the ultimate goal of victory.
It was heart-rendering. For the first time, I think I experienced a lump in my throat. It was hard to talk a couple times. The little kids running up and giving you a kiss and the mothers waving to you. It's quite wonderful. It really was.
In this century, the mobile fighting force has evolved from little more than a bicycle carrying a machine gun to an array of versatile machines, combining the latest in protection, mobility, and firepower. There's no way to know with certainty how the soldier of the next century will cross the battlefield, But this principle will remain. Maneuver will decide the victor. The road to victory will be paved by the potent strike of the mechanized forces.
Now, from the History Channel, you can own the episode you've just seen of Weapons at War. Call 1-800-708-1776. And for only $19.95 plus shipping and handling, receive Weapons at War. Coming up next, do certain crimes capture the spirit of their times? A special presentation asks the question as it takes you from the fading Old West of Butch Cassidy to the jazz-age theft of the Mona Lisa. Then get the inside story on the high-tech horsepower race to produce fast, well-equipped police cars that can outpace the bad guys on wheels of survival. And next week, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, the forgotten city of Angkor, the pyramids of Giza, the Great Wall of China. In Search of History takes you beyond the evocative names into the heart of their mystery on Built to Last Week, beginning Monday at 8 Eastern, 9 Pacific, here on the History Channel, where the past comes alive.